Hey guys, welcome back. Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Hope each one of you are doing great. Those of you who are joining from different time zones, welcome one and all. Welcome to my YouTube channel and the series on TOGAF 9.x certified and beyond. And just as a reminder, the reason why I'm mentioning it as 9.x is I'll be covering both on the 9.1 version as well as on the recently released 9.2. Once we complete the key elements of 9.1, I will move along and talk about the 9.2 standard, what are some of the major changes which has been incorporated, and also I will touch base upon on the certification, like those of you who have recently completed the 9.1 certified certification, what it will take for you to be recertified on the 9.2. It is not much, but still you need to consider updating your knowledge base as per the 9.2 requirements. Okay, great. So let us get started. In today's session, what I'm going to cover is introduction to the ADM. Okay, so what I mean is we will look at ADM, which is the core component of the TOGAF standard, the architecture development methodology. So in today's session, primarily we look at why it is important for an enterprise, what is the value the ADM provides to an enterprise. Okay, what is the significance of it, and then we will move along and look at some of the basic principles ADM plans to attempt, and I will give a brief introduction about each phase. As you can see here on the screen, phases primarily includes preliminary architecture vision and BDAT, what I call it as BDAT, business data application and technology architecture, which are the primary architecture domains of enterprise. Then phases E, F, G and H, okay, mainly opportunities and solutions, migration planning, implementation, governance, architecture, change management, and finally the requirements management, which is a key integral component of the method itself. As you can see, it sits right in the center of the ADM. After the brief introduction of each phases, we will look at some of the other details of ADMs in terms of what it provides as an inputs, outputs, versioning, how an organization can adapt the ADM, the governing piece of the ADM and the repository, what is the significance of a governance model when you start implementing and executing the methodology, and we will look at some of the scoping constraints an organization can take into consideration when they want to move ahead on an architecture activities. Okay, and finally, how does all these pieces fit together from an enterprise architecture integration perspective. Okay, so let us get started. First and foremost, we will look at the ADM from an enterprise perspective, and we will consider here what it provides. The ADM, the methodology itself is built upon an open standard. It is agnostic to any particular vendor, tool, and technology. Okay, so open group is a standard organization which is at this moment supported by more than 600 organizations. So the methodology itself is built upon open standard. It doesn't try to promote any tool, technology, vendor per se. Avoids reinventing the wheel. What this means is, based upon many organizations' success as well as their inputs, feedbacks, etc., the methodology has built and have been evolving. So any organization who wants to take this and up running, they don't have to start from the scratch. The methodology provides lot of details in terms of content, process, inputs, outputs, deliverables, etc. to get your ground up and running. Okay, you can be confident when you start with this method. A proper and a traceable alignment between business and IT. So from the beginning, later you will see from the preliminary phase to architecture vision and the domains, as well as the planning phases, implementation phases, as well as the change management, you should be able to trace from scope, okay, from business requirements to IT and vice versa, based upon the best practices. So the method itself has accumulated the best industry practices and incorporated as the development methodology. So you can trust, you can be confident that you will have success achieved if you follow the best practices recommended by the method. Possible to participate in the evolution of the framework. What this means is, if your organization is interested to come up with your own framework, which is comprised of many other, whether you talk about business, technology, process frameworks, etc., the ADM method helps assist to gradually evolve and achieve to your organization needs and requirements. The TOGAF license is available as part of free perpetual license. Now what this means is, for those of you who wants to use it on a non-commercial basis, it is absolutely free of charge. Okay, for example, if your organization wants to develop an IT architecture for use within your organization, of course you need to satisfy the licensing conditions. Okay, and the meaning of the perpetual license is, you do not have to apply to renew the license, and provided you adhere to the licensing conditions, the license will never be revoked. Okay, and of course it's not only at an organization level, all full-time employees can use the methodology and the artifacts deliverables, including the standard specifications provided. Okay, and of course there is a commercial licensing wherein you have to pay some fees, etc., but for non-commercial purpose, okay, you need to register it with open group, and it is available for you free of cost, and that is the meaning of available under a free perpetual license. Tailorable to meet an organization and industry needs. It doesn't matter which industry you belong to or which vertical you want to apply to, you are easily able to modify the methodology itself to accommodate your organization needs. It is easily able to tailor and customize for your own requirements. Let's continue. Widely adopted in the market. Many different industries as well as verticals have successfully implemented the methodology, and it has its own evolution history. It can go back to more than 3 decades of history, where gradually it has evolved, and many organizations in many different markets have successfully adopted it. The method itself is a complementary. It do not attempt to compete with other frameworks. You talk about other frameworks such as ITIL, COBIT, IT for IT, project management, and any of the other enterprise architecture frameworks as well. So combined together, the ADM supports and complements it. It welcomes the method, the processes, and all the other standards the other frameworks provides. The ADM method as well as the TOGAF framework can sit comfortably within your organization, wherein all other different enterprise frameworks are made available. Okay, the method itself is a comprehensive general method. It is very generic in nature, comprehensive as well. So what you will do, you take the base model, you can use it as is, or you can customize for your organization needs, which we will see very soon in the next few slides. Okay, what are some of those basic principles which ADM provides us? First and foremost, it is an iterative method. The method could be run through the whole process, between phases and within phases. What I mean here is, this is one iteration of the process. When you run through all the phases from phase A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H for a given requirements which is defined in the scope, it is one iteration. It is not necessary that you need to run it through entire process, all the phases for your given requirements. If required, you may just focus on from an architecture vision through all the domain phases. Okay, as I mentioned, this is BDAT, business, data application and technology architecture, or you can just focus on the planning details of the project, architecture project, and high level planning and a detailed level planning, or you can just focus on the implementation part of the project, and so on so forth. Architecture change management. Okay, so what is key point to understand here is it is an iterative method. You can go back, forth, skip phases as needed over the entire process, between the phases as well as within the phases. For each iteration, as I mentioned, your enterprise define an iteration. It could be the entire ADM cycle, or it could be a subset of phases depending upon your need. For each iteration, new decisions needs to be made or considered. Across the enterprise coverage, do you want the ADM to be applicable for the entire organization, for the entire enterprise? Or to what level of detail, in depth, you want to consider the ADM? At what point in time or how much time do you want to spend for a given circumstances? As well, architecture asset reuse. Asset reuse meaning in a given enterprise, you could be running multiple iterations of the project, okay, for a given architecture capability. And one iteration's assets in terms of artifacts, deliverables from the content framework can be used and reused in other iterations. That is the meaning of architecture asset reuse from previous ADM iterations, from other frameworks. Okay, very soon you will see when I mean other enterprise architecture framework, you talk about Zachman, FIAF, DODAF, TIAF, PIAF, etc. Similarly, system models and industry models. And not only that, you can make decisions based on what is the competency level of your organizations in terms of resources and their availability, and what is the value accruing to the enterprise from the methodology execution. So based on those decisions, you can change the way you want to work through the method. So these are some of the basic principles which ADM provides us to consider. And finally, every phase is validated against the current requirements. What that means is your project architecture project begins with a scoped requirements, and as you can see here, the requirements runs through every phase of the project, every phase of the ADM to ensure that you are working towards a defined and an approved set of requirements which are current in nature. Okay, let's move ahead and now let us explore each phase and what details it provides us. Okay, so we will look at each phase and we will introduce the phase. Okay, the first and foremost is the preliminary phase. As you can see, this is outside the actual ADM iteration. What this particular phase provides us is it prepares the organization, the enterprise for a successful architecture project. The architecture project here could be at a project level, at a program level, or at a capability level, okay, a portfolio level. So this is the phase which includes the preparation and initiation activities to create an architecture capability. Not only that, through this phase you understand the enterprise or the business environment. You seek the high level management commitment. You agree on a high level scope for the architecture capability. You establish the architecture principles, and more important, you establish the governance structure as well. Based upon your organization's capacity, capability, etc., you customize the TOGAF framework itself. As you can see, this is the foundational phase for a given organization. What about architecture vision? Okay, architecture vision is for every architecture project. For a given architecture capability, if you decide to run 3 iterations, there will be three architecture vision projects being run in parallel or in sequence, or one triggering another depending upon your organization's capacity to execute. But what is more important is, for every architecture vision, you set the scope, constraints, and expectations for a TOGAF project. Not only that, you prepare the vision, this is the deliverable, and you validate the business context which has been set in the preliminary phase, and create and get approved the statement of architecture work. Okay, without the statement of architecture work, you are not allowed to proceed. It is as good as a statement of work for any project. You need to get the statement of architecture work approved. Okay, moving along, develop the business architecture. So what you do, the business architecture is the business of your organization. Here, during this phase, you look at your organization structure, business goals, objectives, business functions, business services, business processes, business roles, correlation of organization and functions, etc. And then, if required, you will go seek external reference models, viewpoints, and then define the as is or the baseline of the business architecture, as well as define the to be or the target business architecture. Okay, this is the baseline, this is the target, and then also look at the gaps. By performing the gap analysis, and then identify a candidate roadmap components required to fulfill the gaps. Okay, you perform the as is analysis, the to be analysis, identify the gaps as well as the roadmap components. And once this is being documented, you conduct a formal stakeholder review. All the business related stakeholders get together, review the details. Either they approve or they will ask you to revisit and make any needed changes, and then finalize the business architecture, and then you incorporate all those details into architecture definition document. An architecture definition document is another major deliverable which run through multiple phases, output coming from one phase as an input into another phase, and so on and so forth. Okay, but from business architecture perspective, the architecture definition document gets filled in as part of the business architecture section. The same thing continues as part of information systems architecture. Information systems architecture is primarily made up of two architectures, the data architecture and the technology architecture. But from the process perspective, you perform the same activities. You identify all the major information or data related components. Okay, sorry, this is not technology, this is application architecture. Okay, let me step back. Information systems architecture is made up of two main architectures, data architecture and application architecture. And from a process perspective, you perform the same steps. You identify any major information or data related components, application architecture related components, and the relationship between each among them. For data, you identify the baseline, the target. For application, you identify the baseline, the target. You perform the gap analysis. You identify the gap. You identify the roadmap components. You document all the details. Get it reviewed with respective stakeholders who belongs to data architecture and application architecture, and then document it as part of architecture definition document. Okay, the same principle applies as part of the technology architecture. You define the baseline, you define the target, you identify the gaps as part of the analysis, and then identify the candidate building blocks or the major components required to fulfill those gaps. Document those as part of the architecture definition document. Okay. So for a given architecture project, by the end of these three phases, business architecture, information systems architecture, which makes up the data and application as well as the technology, you define the enterprise architecture for your organization, which is primarily made available as part of architecture definition document. And then as you move along, these two phases primarily helps you to put up a plan for execution. Phase E talks about the opportunities and solutions. Here you perform the initial implementation plan. So what you do here is you identify the major implementation projects as work packages, and if the work packages are major or complex enough, you identify whether a sequential or an incremental approach is required. If so, you determine the transition architectures. Okay, transition architecture 1, transition architecture 2, 3, etc. And also you decide upon the approach. How do you want to get this done? Whether do you want to buy those major work packages? Do you want to build them? Do you want to reuse them, outsource them, or get them as part of commercial of the self or COTS or through open sources? As well, you assess the priorities, which needs to be done first, second, and so on and so forth. So the key point to note here is phase E is about initial planning activity. As part of phase F is where you do the detailed implementation and migration planning. This is another important deliverable known as implementation and migration planning. All the high-level work packages, the dependencies, the transition architectures, what you have identified here, you put up a concrete and a final plan in terms of cost benefit analysis, in terms of risks. Okay, you analyze all those details and you put forward all them as part of implementation and migration plan. And then for the plan which has been put forward here, you actually implement as part of the plan. So here it is a two-part, the implementation part and the governance from. From an architecture perspective, you provide the architectural oversight for the implementation being done as part of the plan. And you will also ensure that each project, which is the implementation project, they conforms to the architecture which has been put forward as part of the architecture definition document, implementation migration plan, or as well as part of the architecture contract between the implementation team and the architecture team. As one or multiple architecture projects been executed, architecture change management, which is phase H, provides the continual monitoring as well as the change management process. Any change from requirement scope, from the vision perspective, from the domains perspective, from planning, implementation are routed through the architecture change management, and the governance which is established here is brought into action, and they make the decision whether to include it or exclude it. Okay, whether they have to approve it or not approve it, or they want to take it into consideration in the future releases of the projects. Okay, and finally requirements management. This requirements management is activated, is involved from the beginning, and not only for this particular iteration, it is active and get involved in all the architecture projects. Okay, as you can see here, requirements are identified and selected as part of the architecture capability, and then scoped out, and then detailed out, planned, implemented, and monitored and controlled. Okay, so requirements management is the key phase of the ADM phases. Okay, so as you can see here, ensures that every stage of the TOGAF project is based on and validates the business requirements. It is run through as well as validated as part of every stage of the TOGAF project. The TOGAF project is a single iteration of the phases. Again, just to make sure, it is your organization, the architecture practice decides what makes up the architecture project. It could be made up of one phase or multiple phases, or within the phase, skipping the phases, etc. What you see here is an example of the steps which is provided by every ADM phase. In this example, what you see is the steps provided by the business architecture. So these are those steps which the standard provides from a reference perspective. It is not mandatory that you need to follow all the steps which has been provided here. You can skip, you can extend, you can customize these steps based upon your requirement. Okay, as an example, as a reference, for every phase, steps has been provided, which your organization will customize based upon your requirements. On the same lines, every phase provides several inputs and outputs. So one or more deliverables being worked in a particular phase provides input into the next phase, and changes, enhancements, deletions, etc. are done to the deliverables, and they are being provided to the next phase. Again, these are just as a suggestions. Okay, you can customize them as per your requirement. Now to track a version number is recommended by TOGAF. 0.1, 0.2, etc. is a high level outline. This is the draft version which is still work in progress. Once it is been reviewed with respect to stakeholders and formally reviewed and accepted, it takes the full version 1.0, 2.0 and etc. Okay, so this slide is about the ADM inputs, outputs and the versioning which has been provided by the TOGAF standard. Adapting the ADM based upon your requirement, your enterprise can apply it to different geographies, different vertical sectors and different industries. Some of the examples of vertical sectors could be automotive, banking, finance, food and beverage, government. It could be at a federal level, at a state level, local level. It could be vertical as an example, healthcare, insurance, etc. And some of the examples of industries could be aerospace industry, agricultural industry, chemical industry, construction, real estate, entertainment, telecommunication, transport, etc. Okay, so it could be applied at a geographical level, at a vertical level, and or at an industry level. As well, the ADM itself could be adaptable to the deliverables coming from other frameworks such as PAF, which is a pragmatic enterprise architecture framework, FIAF, which is federal, DODAF, which is defense, and then ZACMAN, which is more of a taxonomy based framework. Okay, and the ADM itself is generally modified or extended based upon your specific needs. How do you scope the architecture and what are some of the constraints? The scoping is primarily based upon four dimensions as per the TOGAF standard: the breadth, depth, time period, architecture domains. What does this means? From a breadth perspective, to what scope of the enterprise you want to consider the methodology. Do you want to apply the method across the entire enterprise, or do you want to just focus on some part of the enterprise? The depth, to what level of detail you want to go. Do you want to be at an enterprise level? Do you want to be at a domain level? Do you want to be at a capability level, and so on and so forth? And how much time? When is the right time you want to spend either at an enterprise or at the detail level, at different levels? And then from an architecture domain, as I mentioned, the enterprise architecture itself is made up of four domain architectures: business, data, application, and technology. And what are those some of the reasons which may be considered for constraining them? It depends upon the authority, the organizational authority of the team producing the architecture. So this is the enterprise practice or the architecture team who is involved of delivering the architecture to the organization. Or the other reason to constrain could be the stakeholders' concerns. Depending upon the stakeholders' requirement, you may have to slim, or you may have to keep it short, or you may want to extend the method itself. And then there are other constraints such as who is available, where are they available, when they are available, how much money is allocated on this activity, etc. So these are some of the primary reasons to constrain and scope the architecture work for a given enterprise. And finally, what you see here is what I just summarized. From the breadth, which tells us to what extent you want to consider the architecture work from an enterprise perspective, to what level do you want to be at an enterprise level or at a segment or at a capability level. And then within each of these, how much time do you want to spend? How much time do you want to spend on each of these? And then the domain architectures itself, collectively known as BDAT. Okay, so this is about the enterprise integration of the different architectures at different coverage from a breadth perspective, from different depth, from level perspective, time span or time period, as well as from architecture domains. Okay, so let us review what we have covered in today's session. First and foremost, we looked at the ADM itself, why it is truly an enterprise level ADM. Okay, what promise it provides and what are those factors which has evolved and which is made available to an enterprise. Then we looked at some of the basic principles the EDM provides. We moved ahead and then we looked at introduction of each phases from EDM perspective at a very high level introduction. And then we looked at, as an example, the inputs, outputs, and the versioning which the standard provides us. We looked at the steps as an example provided by the method for every phase, which is not mandatory to follow. You can customize and you can extend it based upon your requirement. Then we looked at how an enterprise can adapt as well as constrain the ADM itself. Okay. We looked at the governing as well as the governance repository. Okay. So governing, what I mean here is The ADM process itself is complex and it is a key process to the organization. So the architecture board is established as part of the preliminary phase. So it is the responsibility of the architecture board to ensure that the process, that's the ADM process, is executed and maintained successfully, as well as any assets in terms of artifacts and deliverables coming out of it is controlled, versioned, as well as made as part of the repository. That is what I'm referring here as part of the governing the ADM and governance repository. And finally, we looked at the enterprise integration from an architecture perspective in terms of breadth, depth, time period, as well as the domain architectures. So after this understanding, what you can expect in my next topic. So this particular topic was more related to the introduction of the ADM. So in my next topic, I'm going to go one level deeper into the ADM phases. We will look at each phase and its details. Okay. I hope you all enjoyed this particular session. As usual, thank you guys. Thanks for your time. Okay. Have a great day and a great afternoon and a great evening. Those of you who are joining in from different time zones. Until next time, take care and thank you so much for watching. Please take a moment to subscribe to my channel, like this video, share it with your friends as well. Put on any comments if you have about the video. Thank you so much guys. Until next time, see you then. Okay? Bye for now.